I was somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean when I was fired. No meeting, no call, no warning, just an email that landed on my phone while the cabin lights were dimmed and most people around me were asleep, their seats reclined, their lives still intact. The subject line was short and clean, the kind executives like because it feels professional and final. Notice of termination. I remember staring at it for a few seconds before opening it, not because I was scared, but because it felt out of place. I was in the middle of a trip the company had planned months in advance. 3 continents, 5 cities, one deal that had taken me years to build. I opened the email. It said my role at Novagrid had been terminated, effective immediately. It thanked me for my service. It said access would be revoked upon landing. It said someone else would handle all ongoing negotiations. That was it. 14 years reduced to 6 lines of text written by someone who was not even awake while I was reading it. I didn't react right away. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there with my phone in my hand while the plane continued moving forward like nothing important had happened at all. Around me, the flight attendants whispered as they passed. Someone coughed a few rows back. The engines hummed steadily, indifferent to the fact that my entire professional life had just been erased while I was trapped in a seat I couldn't leave. I scrolled back up and read it again, slower this time, checking for context, for an explanation, for something that made it make sense. There was none. What made it worse was not the firing itself. It was the timing. I was flying to close a deal worth more than $1.5 billion, a deal I had personally built over years of quiet work, late nights, missed holidays, and constant travel. I knew every client involved. I knew the history behind every hesitation, every delay, every reason they still trusted us, or rather trusted me. I had worked for Novagrid for 14 years. I had joined when the company was still small enough that people knew each other's names. I stayed as it grew into something larger, louder, and colder. I stayed through restructures, leadership changes, and strategies that looked good in presentations but broke things behind the scenes. I stayed because I believed loyalty still meant something. I stayed because my work mattered. I stayed because I gave the company my time, my energy, and large parts of my life that I never got back. And now I was being removed while I was literally in the air, still representing the company, still expected to land, smile, and hand over everything I had built to someone else. I thought about my daughter, Bella, back home. She would be finishing school around that time, probably asking if I had landed yet, probably proud that I was on another important trip, as she liked to call it. She had grown up with my suitcase always near the door, with dinners moved around flight schedules, with birthdays planned between time zones. Everything I had done was supposed to give her stability. I locked my phone and rested it on the tray table, staring at the dark screen as if it might change its mind and light up with a correction. It didn't. Somewhere between turbulence and silence, it became clear that this wasn't a mistake. This was intentional, administrative, calculated. They hadn't fired me because I failed. They fired me because they believed the system would keep working without me. And as the plane continued forward, carrying me toward meetings I was no longer officially part of, one thought settled in calmly and clearly. They had removed my title, but they had not removed my relationships. They had not removed the trust, and they had no idea what they had just disconnected. That understanding did not feel like anger. It felt like certainty, and that certainty would change everything that came next. I should tell you who I am before this goes any further, because what happened only makes sense when you understand what this job meant to me. My name is Elena. I worked at Novagrid for 14 years. Not 14 years of jumping companies, not 14 years of chasing titles, 14 years in the same place, building the same systems, fixing the same problems, watching the company grow while my own life quietly adjusted around it. I wasn't someone who joined late and benefited from what already existed. I was there when things were unstable, when processes were half-built, when clients didn't trust us yet. I helped make Novagrid look reliable before it actually was. I stayed because I believed in consistency, because I believed that if you gave enough time and effort, eventually it counted for something. At home, my world was much smaller. I have a daughter named Bella. She's the kind of child who notices things adults think they're hiding, the kind who listens more than she speaks, the kind who learned early that her mother's job came with distance. When Bella was younger, she used to ask me to bring her something small from every trip. Not gifts, just proof I'd been somewhere. A boarding pass, a hotel key card, a napkin with another city's name printed on it. As she got older, she stopped asking. She understood without needing it explained. I worked because I had to, but I also worked because stability mattered. Novagrid paid the bills, Novagrid paid for school supplies, Novagrid paid for rent and groceries, and the quiet comfort of knowing Bella wouldn't feel the panic I felt growing up. That mattered to me, so when opportunities came that required more travel, more responsibility, more trust, I said yes. I became the person sent when deals were sensitive, when clients needed reassurance, when leadership needed someone calm enough to handle pressure without making noise. Inside the company, my role was never flashy. I wasn't loud in meetings. I wasn't political. I solved problems. I remembered details. I followed through. Clients noticed. Executives mostly didn't. To them, I was reliable, which is another way of saying invisible. And I accepted that, because being essential was protection. I thought if I made myself useful enough, irreplaceable enough, no one would ever treat me as disposable. That belief is what kept me saying yes, what kept me flying, what kept me missing small moments with Bella that I told myself I would make up later. Later never arrived. By the time I boarded that flight across 3 continents, the one meant to close the biggest deal Novagrid had ever attempted, I truly believed I was securing our future, mine, Bella's, and the company's. What I didn't know yet was that the company had already decided my future without me, and that while I was mid-air, still working, still representing them, still protecting their interests, they were preparing to remove my name from everything I had built. At Novagrid, my role was never described properly, even on paper. Titles shifted, responsibilities expanded, but the expectations stayed the same. That I would be there, that things would work, that clients would stay calm, and that deadlines would be met. I was the one clients called when something felt off. Not when something was broken, but when they sensed it might be. Before anyone else noticed, I knew which regions needed more reassurance, which executives wanted details, which ones wanted summaries, which partners needed calls instead of emails, and which ones only trusted numbers if I explained how they were built. That kind of knowledge does not come from dashboards. It comes from years of listening, from being present, from remembering what people care about. When systems scaled, I adjusted them quietly. When contracts grew complicated, I simplified them before they reached the board. When a deal stalled, I knew which conversation to restart and which one to leave alone. Leadership saw outcomes, not process. They saw that deals closed, that timelines held, that relationships stayed intact. They did not ask how, because things working made them comfortable. I trained teams across continents without being introduced as leadership. I joined late calls and early mornings because global work did not respect time zones, and because clients trusted my voice. I never corrected executives in meetings, even when they repeated my ideas as if they were new, because results mattered more than recognition. Or so I told myself. Over time, I became the person others depended on, without being the person anyone defended. If something succeeded, it was the company. If something struggled, it was handled quietly before it reached anyone important. I made myself useful, and usefulness became invisibility. Looking back, that was the mistake. Not the work, not the effort, but believing that being essential would protect me. It never does. And while I was busy keeping everything steady, they were learning exactly how much they could take, without asking, without credit, without consequence. The cost did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. It settled in quietly and stayed. It showed up in the way my days stretched longer without me noticing, in the way meetings filled the spaces that used to belong to evenings, in the way my phone stayed within reach even when it should not have mattered. Bella noticed before I did. Children usually do. She would ask why I was still typing when dinner was ready, why my laptop followed me from room to room, why I smiled at my screen instead of at her sometimes. I told her work was important, that things were busy, that it would slow down soon. I had been saying that for years. There were mornings I left before she woke up, and nights I came back when she was already asleep, and weekends that were technically free, but never really quiet. I learned how to listen to client calls while helping with homework, how to mute meetings so I could say goodnight, how to read emails in the dark so I wouldn't wake her. I missed school events, not because I forgot, but because something always felt urgent. A deadline, a negotiation, a call that could not wait. Each time I chose work, I told myself it was temporary, that stability required sacrifice, that I was doing this for her. What I did not realize was that the sacrifice was becoming permanent. At Novagrid, no one asked what it cost me. They only noticed that I never dropped the ball. Leadership liked that I didn't complain, that I solved problems without escalation, that I absorbed pressure quietly. They began to rely on that silence. Responsibilities were added without discussion. Expectations grew without acknowledgement. And when something went wrong, the question was never how to support me, only why it had not been prevented. At home, Bella started leaving the light on at night. She said she didn't like not knowing when I would come in. That should have been my warning, but exhaustion has a way of convincing you that this is normal, that loyalty will be rewarded, that being essential is the same as being valued. I stayed because I believed showing up would protect me, because I believed my history mattered, because I believed 14 years meant something. By the time they decided to erase me, I had already given more than I could afford. I just didn't know the bill was about to arrive.
The shift did not happen all at once. It started subtly. In meetings where my name stopped being mentioned, in emails where decisions were made without me copied, in conversations that ended just before I walked into the room. I noticed my work being summarized by other people, not inaccurately, just without me attached to it. Plans I had built over months were suddenly referred to as team initiatives. Strategies I had negotiated personally were described as leadership direction, and when results came in, the praise moved upward, never sideways, never back. I told myself this was how large companies worked, that visibility was political, that substance mattered more than credit. I kept my head down and kept the systems running. Then the requests changed. I was asked to document processes that had never been written down, to explain relationships that depended on trust and history, to prepare transition notes for roles that were not changing, at least not officially. When I asked why, the answers were vague. Future planning, succession readiness, organizational hygiene, words that sound harmless until they are not. I was still flying constantly, still closing gaps between teams across continents, still smoothing problems before executives ever heard about them. But I could feel it, the way you feel a room cool when someone opens a door behind you. At a leadership review, someone presented a roadmap I had built, using my data, my assumptions, my projections. My name did not come up once. When I corrected a detail, the room went quiet, then someone smiled and said, "Right, yes, good catch," as if I were commenting on someone else's work. Afterward, one of the executives pulled me aside, told me I was doing incredible work, that I should stay focused, that recognition would come. It sounded rehearsed. That was when I understood. They were not questioning my value, they were planning around it. I had become infrastructure. Important, invisible, easy to forget until it fails, and people only notice infrastructure when it stops working. I did not know exactly when the decision was made, only that by the time it reached me, it had already been approved, reviewed, and sanitized of anything human. The company I had protected for 14 years had already decided it could move forward without me. They just hadn't told me yet. The realization did not arrive like a dramatic moment. There was no sudden clarity or speech in my head. It came slowly through repetition, through patterns that did not make sense until they did. I was still being called when things broke, still the person teams reached out to when deadlines slipped or clients hesitated, still the one asked to step in quietly and stabilize conversations that were about to go wrong. What changed was who spoke after I fixed them. Executives would enter the room once the tension had settled, once the decisions were already shaped, once the work had been done, and they would present it as alignment, as leadership foresight, as strategic clarity. Clients continued to trust me, not the title, not the brand, but me. They would message directly, asking if timelines were realistic, asking if numbers could be trusted, asking if promises would be kept. I answered honestly, the way I always had, and they listened. I started noticing something else. contracts that required my approval before finalization, agreements structured around my oversight, decision chains that quietly routed back to me before moving forward. Not because anyone had planned it that way, but because over 14 years, people had learned where certainty lived. I had built that without realizing it. One solved problem at a time, one kept promise at a time, one late night fixing something that was not technically my responsibility. The company had systems, but those systems leaned on relationships, and those relationships leaned on memory, and that memory lived with me. I was not holding access. I was holding continuity, and continuity is invisible until it is gone. During one call, a senior client asked a simple question: if I would still be overseeing the final phase of the rollout. I hesitated just for a second, not because I was unsure, but because no one had told me the answer. The silence on the line stretched, not uncomfortable, just expectant. When I said I would confirm, the client said, "Please do, we trust you." That sentence stayed with me, not as validation, but as information, because trust like that does not belong to companies, it belongs to people. And I finally understood something that leadership had missed. They believed they owned the work because they owned the structure. They did not realize that the structure was standing because I was still underneath it. They had already decided I was replaceable, but they had not yet tested that belief. And soon, without confrontation, without threats, without any kind of scene, they were going to find out what happened when the person holding everything together stopped compensating for what leadership did not understand.
I didn't make a decision that night. There was no dramatic moment, no list of pros and cons, no speech in my head. I just stopped correcting things. The first client email came in while I was still airborne. A short message, polite, confused. They were asking why a document had been revised without their approval, why the timeline they had signed off on was suddenly different, why the person copied on the thread was someone they had never worked with before. Normally, I would have fixed it quietly. I would have replied with context, smoothed the misunderstanding, protected the company from looking disorganized. This time, I read it, and I closed the email, not out of spite, not to prove a point, but because I no longer worked there, and I finally allowed that truth to be real. Over the next few days, more messages came in, from partners, from regional leads, from teams who didn't know I was gone yet. They weren't asking where I went. They were asking why nothing made sense anymore, why approvals were looping, why decisions were being reversed, why meetings kept happening without outcomes. I didn't redirect them. I didn't explain. I didn't warn anyone. I just didn't step in. And something subtle began to happen. Not a collapse, not panic, confusion. Meetings extended longer than scheduled. Emails multiplied instead of resolving issues. Clients asked for clarification that no one could give with confidence. The people now presenting my work spoke well. They had the slides, they had the titles, but they didn't have the answers. And clients noticed. One of them called me directly, not to complain, not to accuse, just to ask, quietly, what changed? I told them the truth, that I was no longer with Novogrid, that I hadn't been part of the recent decisions, that I couldn't speak for the company anymore. There was a pause on the line. Then they said something that stayed with me. That explains a lot. After that, I stopped receiving questions and started receiving invitations, private ones, discreet ones, coffee when you're back on the ground, a quick call off the record, an introduction to someone who had been watching my work for years. I didn't announce anything. I didn't update my profile. I didn't say I was available. I simply stopped holding a system together that no longer belonged to me. And without anyone naming it, without any press, without any statement, the center of gravity shifted, not because I pulled it, but because I stepped away. And for the first time in 14 years, I didn't feel responsible for saving something that had already decided I was replaceable. The impact didn't arrive all at once. There was no headline, no emergency call, no announcement that something was wrong. It showed up in small fractures. Clients began asking for second opinions, not formally, not aggressively, just quietly. They asked questions that used to have clear answers, and now didn't. Projects stalled in review cycles that never ended.
timelines slipped by weeks, then months. The people assigned to replace me worked hard. I could see that from the outside. But effort wasn't the problem. They didn't know why certain decisions had been made years ago, why some clients needed flexibility, while others needed precision, why some systems could bend, and others would snap if touched. They followed documentation, but documentation is never the full story. The full story lives in memory, in patterns, in knowing when silence is better than explanation, and when a single sentence can save a relationship. Novagrid started losing that quietly. One client delayed renewal, another reduced scope, another asked to pause discussions entirely. Internally, leadership treated each one as isolated, unrelated, temporary. They didn't see the shape of it yet. I did, because I had spent 14 years watching how trust builds and how quickly it erodes when the wrong person is put in the wrong seat. Someone from the executive floor reached out eventually. Not John, someone else. They asked if I'd be open to a short-term consulting arrangement, just to stabilize things, just until the transition settled. I said no, not angrily, not dramatically. I said I had moved on, which was true. Behind the scenes, the deals I had built began dissolving into smaller conversations, side calls, private meetings. Clients didn't leave all at once. They never do. They wait, they observe, they compare, and when enough doubt accumulates, they make quiet decisions that never make it into official reports. Novagrid didn't collapse overnight. It became heavy, slower, less certain. Meetings multiplied, confidence thinned, and the people at the top started realizing something they hadn't before, that the work hadn't been the system had been the person. By the time they understood that, there was nothing left to recover, only damage to manage. And I wasn't watching with satisfaction or anger. I was busy building something else, somewhere that didn't require me to disappear in order to function. What came next did not feel like revenge. It felt like relocation. I did not announce anything. I did not explain myself publicly. I did not correct the narrative Novagrid was still telling about why I was gone. I simply started answering calls that were no longer about saving something broken. They were about building something clean. One client reached out first, someone I had worked with for years, someone who knew how decisions were actually made. They asked where I was headed next, not because they wanted to follow, but because they wanted stability. I told them the truth, that I was starting fresh, that I was open to work, that I would not promise miracles, only clarity and consistency. That was enough. Another call followed, then another, each one quieter than the last, each one already informed. They did not ask what happened at Novagrid. They already knew. Organizations always know more than leadership thinks. When I told Bella I would be home more often, she didn't react right away. She just looked at me carefully, like she was checking whether the words would hold. I stopped missing dinners, stopped answering emails late at night, stopped measuring my worth by how unavailable I could be. The work I moved into paid more, not dramatically, but enough to notice. More importantly, it had boundaries, clear ones. When I said I needed time, it was accepted. When I said no, it was respected. Novagrid tried once more, a different tone, a different voice. They asked if I would consider returning in an advisory role. They said they were willing to discuss compensation, structure, authority. I listened, then declined. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something. They did not lose me when they fired me. They lost me when they decided I was replaceable, after 14 years of proof. Bella started sleeping better. So did I. The world did not explode. No one applauded. Nothing dramatic happened, but something important did. I stopped surviving and started choosing. And Novagrid continued adjusting to a reality where the quiet center they relied on was no longer there to absorb the weight. They kept going. So did I, just in very different directions. Time passed, not quickly, but steadily. Novagrid did not collapse overnight. That is not how systems fail. They fail quietly, through missed connections, through delays that stack, through decisions made without context.
I heard things later, not from gossip, but from people who had once depended on me. Projects slowed, clients hesitated, internal reviews multiplied, not because anyone was incompetent, but because the memory of how things actually worked was gone. I did not celebrate that. I did not feel satisfaction watching it happen. What I felt was distance. Distance from urgency. Distance from fear. Distance from the version of myself who believed endurance was the same as loyalty. Bella grew into a calmer rhythm. Mornings were slower. Evenings were hours. She stopped asking if I would be late, stopped checking my phone for me, stopped bracing herself for absence. One night, she said something simple. She said, "You look like you belong where you are now." I understood then that this story was never really about a job, or a company, or even being fired mid-flight. It was about what happens when you give your life to a system that does not know how to hold it, and what happens when you finally take that life back. If this story felt familiar, if you have ever been invisible while carrying weight, if you have ever been loyal to a place that confused your silence for weakness, I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment. Not to explain, not to justify, just to say you were here. Because stories like this only matter when they are shared. And if you want more stories told this way, calm, honest, without shouting, subscribe. Not for drama, but for truth. And for the quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop holding together what was never built to value you.